Hello, I'm Tessa Kalman, and I'm the Visual Information Specialist for the Dayton VA Medical Center, and I also function as our historian and our archives manager. Maybe start with the earliest memories that you have. So, Mr. Arthur, when you were a child and you lived here, what were some of your fondest memories?
The neatest thing, family lived here from 41 through 59 when I got married, and then my parents lived a few more years after that before Dad retired. But at that time it was 640 acres, and there was a fence around the entire property, and my mother never worried about us kids getting lost. She said always find the fence, follow the fence, and we get home. We lived in a house that was just inside the Anderson gate, which made it easy. She didn't worry, and the men that lived here, if you got lost, there's always somebody that would take you home. It was a great place.
If I recall, that house then became the post office for the facility?
It was a post office first.
It was first, okay.
And then somewhere in the 30s it became a residence for doctors and other employees.
Okay. And as far as you know, the reason that we don't have that building here anymore, am I correct that the road was expanded at that time?
Gettysburg Avenue was widened. That house came down in order to widen Gettysburg.
Charlie, you came in the 1970s. What were some of the earliest memories you have of the facility?
Actually, we started in 74 grounds maintenance. The conservatory was still there. It wasn't being used, and I thought it was a magnificent building. I'm a gardener by design, by nature. I like flowers and plants, and I had fond hopes of working inside the conservatory, only to be a part of its demise. But the medical center was in a transitional phase, and I think it was going from the old to the more modern. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the older buildings then was becoming unusable as new buildings was built. So I came in at the beginning of the new medical center age, and saw the tail end of a lot of the old buildings and things that Bill had grew up with.
Right. We were transitioning from very much a residential type facility where we had thousands of veterans living here on campus, transitioning to more of a medical outpatient type facility, and we had a lot of buildings and facilities here that they were no longer needed in their original purpose. So, well, Jake, can you tell us about your early days?
I came on board about 1980, and I remember some of the buildings. Not only did they have number designations, they were called sections. You had Section 20. Being a new employee, trying to figure out where Section 20 was compared to a different building, so it was an eye-opener for me. I started in the air conditioning. No, actually, I started in the grounds maintenance repair shop, and learned to work with the fellows, the older fellows. They used to, before they as you were saying, the transition, they used to have the old fellows come over and pick up a lawnmower and go out and cut grass. And those guys took that job really serious. And of course, when they ended that, the fellows were hurt. But they moved on, and we moved on. And then I transferred to the air conditioning system. Worked in all the old buildings, and learned a lot of the history of the VA. And as Bill said, I just fell in love with the place. Incredible history we have here.
That's right. Well, as we spoke earlier, that we had a large residential population here at the VA where the veterans lived and worked and received their care. And it very much resembled a village. And we had buildings here that fit into that scope of care. We had barracks where they slept. We had places where they could get entertainment. And I guess I would just like for you to describe, Mr. Arthur, what kind of buildings or features of the grounds that were here that still related to those old days when the veterans lived here as a society.
Well, the whole thing has changed a lot in the last, particularly in the last 70 years or so. But I can remember back the conservatory greenhouse that sat up on the edge of the grotto. Absolutely beautiful thing, and one of the most visited conservatories in the country at the time. All kinds of flowers. The man in charge was Mr. Merle. Don't know his first name because in those days kids always said Mr. or Doctor or whoever. But he was in charge. And there was also an old Italian, Louis, and an old black man, Andy, that worked for Mr. Merle, that took care of the grotto and the flowers, and they loved what they were doing. The Memorial Hall that was torn down in the late 50s sometime, that seated about 1,600 people. Beautiful building, shows going on all the time. It was, at least every week there was some big show coming in. And even, I must have been somewhere maybe 8 years old, something like that. One of the shows was a USO show that had a lot of veterans in it. And the last act, and it's amazing sometimes your memory goes back so far in your life, but the last act was tap dancing.
Okay.
So two guys come out tap dancing, and one appeared to have his left leg tied up behind him, and the other one appeared to have his right leg tied up behind him. And they danced for 10 minutes. It was absolutely fantastic. And then they took off. They had this huge overcoat or raincoat around them. They took that off, and you're expecting them to drop their other leg and walk off. They didn't have another leg. One guy had the right leg, and the other guy had a left leg. That, I think, just really stunned the veterans that were there watching the show. But it's a memory that it's in there from way back, some 5 to 10 years old, something like that.
Really made an impression
Yes.
on you.
The other thing that was the south third of the campus that's now cut off by US 35 was basically farmland, and there was everything that was grown there practically was used in the mess hall. And like I said earlier, my father worked here, but my mother and a dozen family members also worked here, most of them in the mess hall, some in the hospital as nurses, but it was a fantastic place. The old veterans on weekends would sit around the parade ground, which was, the perimeter was lined with benches, and all the hobbies they had, they would sell things on the weekends. And at that time, there were still thousands of people coming in every weekend to hear the music, to meet the veterans.
And these are items the veterans made themselves.
Yes. And one tidbit about the veterans, I don't think they ever thought of being here or staying here as something that was owed to them. They considered it a beautiful place to live. They respected it. They took care of it. And it's amazing that Mr. Otto and there's dozens of them from way back that I can remember. But they were all gentlemen. It was really a fantastic thing.
Those memories are really precious, aren't they?
They are.
They are. Well, Charlie, you were here during the period of time when they were going to build a new highway near campus. Do you have any recollection about what was going on when they were extending 35, Route 35 through here? I remember there being some controversy about that.
Well, there was a great deal of controversy that was over the average employee's head that was taken on by the administration and probably the politicians and the property line. Originally, the medical center had 3 lakes, and the lower lake came into play as being part of the property that they were taking from that, and that caused a lot of concerns on the medical center, as well as the property on the other side of what is now still Gettysburg Avenue. When 35 began, it did take a lot of our southern property from the VA, and it realigned ourselves with the community. and we started putting up fences, and we began to get a look at the transition that was really beginning to happen at the medical center.
And what time period was that?
This was, I think the 35 came in the early 80s, I would think, when that started. But prior to that, in the 70s, the new medical center, the transition from being more of a residential facility to that of a modern outpatient facility was beginning to take shape. A lot of the old buildings that we thought would be saved was no longer tenable with budgetary cuts and manpower that was here. And as Bill spoke, the focus of the veterans that was here began to change as well. And as the hospital needs changed, the medical needs changed, so did the facility. The conservatory was torn down. A lot of the older buildings was gone. But still, the medical center still maintained its relationship with the public. We had numerous concerts by the Dayton Philharmonic Orchestra, and they would come out and do outdoor concerts, and they did some in the grotto, some behind Patrick, some over the old quarters building. And they would come every year, and it was a big draw for the public, and they would come out for the concert. The patients really loved it, and the members and employees too. So it was some of the old being held on to while the new was being transitioned in. It wasn't just, this is gone. It was somewhat of a smooth as possible transition for a federal facility.
Good to know. And Jake, you said that you'd worked in a lot of the buildings that were here. What were the buildings that they chose to tear down at that time? Do you recall sort of the decision making behind that, and what kind of buildings seemed to be the ones most vulnerable?
I'm not familiar with the reasoning behind the buildings, but as Charles had said earlier, they were buildings that really there was no longer a need for.
More like
They
residential?
sat empty for a while.
Okay.
And some deterioration, and the repair costs would be way more than the building was worth, given their new role. And
Right.
it was sad to see it, of course, but a lot of old-time stuff got thrown away.
Do you recall in the early part of your career here, what were some of the new structures that they put up at the time and what they were used for?
Well, they added some, what would you call it, Charles, on top of building 305, the 310, they put the old sun heated piping, what can I think of, solar powered stuff, solar
Okay.
panels. That was one thing. They built the teachers' education building back there. They expanded 320 quite a bit, the nursing home 320.
320, yeah, at that time. When it was first built, I believe it was a domiciliary type residential facility and then transitioned to a nursing home. Okay. Well, since the very early times from in the 1800s, we've had a feature here at the VA that's referred to as the grotto. And it's a feature where we have some natural springs here on the property, and those natural springs have been used to form man-made lakes here. And the original Civil War veterans who lived here actually sculpted out those lakes. They used them for drinking water. And slowly over time, they became a real source of beauty for the medical center. The gardens that were associated with the grotto were a huge tourist attraction, and it brought people from all over the country to visit this place. And I guess I'd be interested to know what the grotto looked like when you lived here, its role that it played here at the VA when you first came.
It was a very beautiful place, well taken care of by Andy and Louie, two of Mr. Merle's people. The center of the grotto, that's now just grass, was a huge flower bed. Some of the things that have been opened up and exposed by Bob Neff and the group of master gardeners, I don't even remember that they were hidden by vines and all kinds of stuff for too many years. But it was always a beautiful place, and some of the old veterans would one of the guys from the Spanish-American War that I knew was carved peach seeds.
Okay.
And that was his favorite place, to come down in the grotto, sit under one of the trees, and carve peach seeds. And I really believe that the shellac and the brushes and some of the tools he used might still be hidden in that wall. He showed me that spot one day when I was like 6 or 7, but it disappeared in my mind, but I'm sure it's still there. The boathouse is still there. That's where I used to sit and sing songs to my girlfriend, which I later married, and we're coming up to 60 years now.
Congratulations.
The walkway around the grotto that's been, I guess, Home Depot was part of helping
Yes,
redo
some of
that.
the restoration.
When I lived here, it was gravel, very fine gravel, and that was my training track when I was running track at Roosevelt High School.
Good.
I could run that track all night, and it was kind of a neat thing. But it was a beautiful place.
So you have the feeling that even back then, that this was kind of a place where veterans could go to relax, to kind of get in touch with nature,
Yes.
and it was a healing spot for them?
Yes, it was. The veterans that were here, they all enjoyed going to the grotto or going down to the lake and fishing. But it was really a great thing for them.
Okay. Well, Charlie, when you were here, you were instrumental in some of the renovations of the grotto area. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what that entailed?
Well, in about 1984, I was serving as the supervisor of ground maintenance, and surveying the grounds one day, I came upon, there's a cobblestone sidewalk on the southern part of the grotto at the top, and it was overgrown. And I saw that, and I just started pulling some vegetation away, and I had some of the employees come down, and we started pulling some things away. Dale Huffman was the Dayton Daily News at that time, did a lot of favorable stories on the VA.
Okay.
And he came out and did an interview with me about the grotto. And one part in this article, and I don't know how this happened, but I paid for it dearly. I stated to him, or he printed, that I had discovered the grotto. That article appeared in the Sunday's paper, and when I came to work Monday morning, every employee in the unit, especially the older guys, was waiting outside in the parking lot for me. And they asked me jokingly, how did I discover something that was there before I was born? And with that, we started to clean up the grotto. The springs that you mentioned by that time had the drainage to the first lake had backed up, and a lot of the areas where Bill Talkley played was flooded out. So we first started just digging that out, putting new drain pipes in to get the water flowing, and as we worked more and more, we just uncovered it. And over the next 3 or 4 years, we stabilized it. We took the growth off the wall. A lot of the older walls had fallen down. We took those out, put up masonry walls behind them, and then put the old walls back in front. We didn't have the manpower, the material to keep it up, and over the next 10 or 15 years, that was the problem.
Right.
Organizations would come in and plant flowers, but walk away and not be there to take care of them, until the group that finally came that we have now, who brought in master gardeners who were there from the Alpha to the Omega and was able to create what we have now, which is not what the veterans did when the grotto was completed, but it is a good reminder, and it has drawn interest to it, and it is a well-kept area that everybody can enjoy now.
Right. Yes, the grotto's it's undergone numerous rebirth, and then kind of languished for a while, and then it'll be brought back, and that's just been its pattern throughout the years, and it all seemed to stem to, as our veteran population would ebb and flow here, and the manpower needed to keep it, up was, something that was a challenge for all the leadership, I think, through all the decades that were here. And Jake, when you were here, can you describe a little bit about how it looked when you came, And did it go through any transformations while you were here? And talk about how you feel about the grotto today.
It certainly did go through some changes. Seeing Charles' crew do what they did, it was pretty overgrown, pretty terrible looking. Jungle-like, actually, I believe would be the term. And Charles and his crew came in and they solved the moisture problem and the water. Great job, Charles, by the way. It was really, you took pride in that because you could see the improvement in it, and you knew how some of the fellows, you would actually see some of the old vets sitting down around there, and it was quiet down there. I remember a lot of the veterans fishing there.
Okay.
It was, and they were actually catching fish, which I don't know who put the fish in there, but the fish were there, and they were successful catching the fish, and we had a water tower at one time in there, which because of the funding was eliminated, it's back. So it was really great and a source of pride to see it come back.
When you were here, was it mostly just the veterans taking advantage of the grotto as compared to in the early days when we had a lot of visitors?
Yes, mostly just the veterans.
Mostly
and
just the
few, not many.
veterans, right? And just give me some of your thoughts today on how the grotto looks and how you think it helps the campus.
Today, there's incredible. It's absolutely beautiful. Charles, you started a great thing, and it kind of thumped around, but your work started it. People were aware of how beautiful it could be, and you started something great. The folks came on board, and they're helping us contain it. It's beautiful. My thoughts are really pride in the grotto.
Great, thank you. Well, we've spoken a little bit about the physical features of the campus, but of course one of the most important components here were the veterans themselves. So I'd like to ask our gentlemen guests here their memories of the veterans that were here when they were here, what wars they served in, and just their general impression of the veterans that they interacted with. So Bill, I'll start with you.
Okay. The veterans that were here back in my day, which expanded over 20-some years, number one, they were all super gentlemen. One of the fellows carved peach seeds, and I think he was from Spanish-American War, which seems like an awful long time back. But he would sit in the grotto and work, carve some beautiful things. And I asked him one day how he decided and what to carve, and he said, you just start cutting and whatever's in there just shows up.
It reveals itself.
He was an interesting kind of guy. Those were from the younger days, and then when I was in high school, I worked in the canteen and the PX. Some of the gentlemen that were in and out of there, Mr. Otto, which every Saturday he came in with his laundry to get it done. Mr. Balby, Mr. Balby was a very tall, stately gentleman, and every day he would come into the PX or the canteen. He was always clean, suit coat on, tie, and he would go down to the YMCA to exercise every day.
Okay.
There was also, I guess, what I would call the Vitalis guy, and I'm not sure he was from First World War, but he would come into the canteen and buy 2 bottles of Vitalis every day.
And Vitalis was?
Vitalis was a hair tonic.
A hair tonic.
And I asked my manager about that, and he said, don't sell him anymore. He said, read the label. Label said 50% by alcohol by volume. That was kind of a weird thing. Then there was Sailor, and unfortunately I cannot pull his name out of my head, but Sailor was, let's see, he might have been World War I. He was paraplegic, so he was confined to his wheelchair all the time. And the first of each month, Sailor would get in his little motorized cart that he had with gasoline powered.
Mhm.
I'd go down to Kinder's on Kennesaw Avenue and load that cart up with half-pint bottles of whiskey. And bring in, and I mean, he was a distributor. He was sort of like a retailer.
Which wasn't quite,
It wasn't quite legal.
with the legal rules of the facility, was
All
it?
of the old guards knew what he did, and they never bothered him. Then one day, new kids on the job, sailor comes in, new kid's making a name for himself, searches sailor's cart, finds all the booze. Sailor gets confined to his barracks for 90 days. The sailor was a little bit like the guys on MASH and a few of the other movies we've seen. He enlisted the help of another veteran that was double amputee. And Sailor would give him the money at the first of the month, and this guy would go down to Kinder's on Kennesaw, take his legs off, stuff them with the half-pint bottles, and bring them back in. And that was, Sailor never missed a sale.
Where there's a will, there's a way, right?
And Sailor was a real gentleman. I just wish I could pull his whole name out. I'm sure he's buried at the National Cemetery, but I'd just like to pay my respects. But
Those are good stories. Well, Charlie, what do you recall? What was the primary veteran of which war when you came here? Do you recall?
It was latter World War II Korea.
World War II Korea. Okay.
My generation from Vietnam were the new kids on the block, so to speak. I won't tell you the vernacular that they used to describe us because we're on cameras for historical purposes, but
Wasn't complimentary, was it?
Not quite, but yeah, working with men, it was what it was. With the patients, back in the day in the 70s and early 80s, we had a patient crew. The buildings within was domiciliaries, and each building had a pride of its own. Each building took care of its own flower beds. We provided the flowers to the patients. They planted their beds. There was an unspoken competition between the buildings and the grounds crew, the beds that we maintained. But part of the grounds maintenance, lawn maintenance crew was a detail that was made entirely of patient veterans. They would come up to grounds in the morning, get their gear, their lawn mowers, and they had a specific area to cut. They cut around the lakes, the grotto area, some of the trimming around the buildings, and they had their areas to cut. And the paid employees, we stayed away from them, and it was what they did. They took pride in their areas.
Right.
We maintained the equipment. If they had a problem, they would bring it in. And a lot of these veterans were not young, but they had been doing it long before I got here. And,
Right.
and that was just built in as part of the job that we didn't stop. That didn't stop until part of the transition was that the patients were here for treatment,
Right.
not for work. And unfortunately, those patients suffered from that loss of something physically and constructive to do. One of the gentlemen who worked for us, his name was Ernie Gowes. When I came here, I was on the tail end of the baseball diamond that was here now where the cemetery administration buildings and those graves sit. It was a beautiful ballpark.
Right.
Ernie kept that field up. Actually, I know there was numerous articles about him in
Yes.
Dayton papers about the job he did there. When that diamond was closed, he worked in grounds as our tool person, what we call.
Okay.
Ernie's background was, I think, was a quartermaster, and nothing left the unit that he didn't have control over. Who had it, where they got it, and if it left clean, it came back clean, no matter what you did with it. He was a great person for that job, and he did it for many years. And that contribution of the patients, I think, added longevity to their lives, because simply because we get older don't mean we get useless.
Sure.
And if you're accustomed to working your whole life, not working is
Right.
a great detriment to you.
Right.
And the job that they did now goes unrecorded until this. Miller's Cottage, building 400, was a domiciliary that was predominantly women.
Right.
And they had a magnificent flower bed that rivaled even our greatest thing, and we had gardeners who took care of our beds, but like I said, they took pride in it. when they would give us their flower order, we would buy them, or they would go buy their own. They watered them, they weeded them, and so did the men
Right.
at 402, 302, 410, 409, building 320. And it was a beautiful facility to see. But as time changed, that kind of just went by the wayside too.
Yeah. As the
And when
population
population
decreased.
changed and new people came in, wasn't interested in that,
Right.
and that kind of died. As an employee in engineering, and Jake can speak on this too, we had the Marine veterans. Each November we would celebrate the Marine Corps' birthday, and we would find the oldest Marine, which is a tradition in the Marine Corps. You find the oldest Marine and the youngest Marine around that would cut the cake. And naturally, for many years, the oldest Marine would be a patient member. And we had one gentleman who was the oldest Marine who actually had his uniform, his dress blue uniforms, in a wheelchair. And each November, we would gather all the Marines, former Marines, we would gather and we would spend time, we'd have a cake, and we'd identify the youngest Marine. They would come up from the Marine Reserve Center here on Gettysburg. Always be a young guy there, we didn't like that, but he was there. And the old gentleman would cut it, but when they did the HIPAA thing, that kind of put a stop to that because we couldn't identify
Patient privacy concerns.
and
Yeah.
So actually our oldest Marine wasn't the oldest Marine, we just was an employee who stood in that place.
I see. And thank you. Well, Jake, when you were here, what are some of the more memorable veterans? What kind of events did we put on here that they enjoyed?
We put on a lot of service related, there are different service branches of service. As Charles was saying, the Marine Corps birthday was a big thing for us. At that last one that we had, Charles, we had the biggest spread between the youngest and the oldest Marine. We had 90 years difference. That was in the whole country, that was the largest spread. But those kind of things we had. And my association with the veterans, in and out of the patient room, was working on the air conditioning equipment and heating equipment. I got to know just a few of them, and a World War I veteran by the name of Leonard Marbury, who was a really neat guy. He got to be like an uncle to me. And he told me the story that as a black child in the South at that period of time, it wasn't a good life to have, and he had managed to capture some moonshine, and that antic would have got him hung at that period of time in the South. So a group came by with a bus offering jobs he was a teenager at the time, offering jobs up at one of the docks up in one of the estates above where he was at. And so he got on the bus, signed the paper, got on the bus. Well, it wasn't really a job. He was shanghaied. He enlisted in the Army. But according to Leonard, being a young black child at the time, going to Europe and seeing what he saw in Europe was one heck of an education.
Yeah.
He learned a lot. He indicated that one of the saddest sounds to him was to hear the train whistles bringing the bodies back from the front.
Okay.
But Leonard was just a super guy. They dressed him up in a tuxedo one day when the representative from the French government was here to hand out I'm not going to get the name right, but it was an award close to meaning the same thing as our Medal of Honor.
Okay.
And I passed him in the hall, and I asked him, I said, Leonard, what do you think? What do you think about this? And he says, what took him so long was his comment to me. And some of the World War II vets that would have a hard time, Navy vets explaining about the kamikaze attacks during World War II. One old Marine, Charles was just asking me if I could remember the name. I cannot remember the name. He was the oldest Marine that we used at our Marine Corps balls. Anyway, he was we buried him from here, but he was an Eagle guy. He was a horse Marine. If you're a former Marine or a Marine, you speak of horse Marines, you're going back pretty far.
Right. I know that today we refer to some of the negative effects from service as PTSD, and do you recall any of the veterans who lived here struggling with that? How they coped with that?
Sure.
Your memories of that?
It was pretty widespread. You saw a lot of it, and they would get help, but sometimes they would just lose it. And there was a couple of female World War I veterans we had here also. I can't remember the guys' names except Leonard, but I'll never forget a lady by the name of Irene Theobald.
Okay.
That lady was outspoken. You could not get ahead of that lady. She worked at a telephone exchange for the Navy. Interesting lady.
So we had beautiful chapels here on the grounds, and I'm kind of interested to know how the spiritual side of things affected our veterans. And I wondered, Bill, if you have any memories of how the chaplains interacted with the veterans, what part that the churches might have played in their life, and also if you have any memories of our medical staff here, any of the doctors.
I guess I can't really relate back to the chaplains. I know when I was in high school, I used to attend services at the chapel, which is right across the parking lot.
The Protestant chapel?
But the doctors that I knew, because the house that we lived in was I guess it's duplex, upstairs and a downstairs unit. And we lived upstairs at one time, and we lived downstairs for a while. But all of the doctors that I knew were just outstanding people and really cared about their patients. And there was Dr. Nolan, I think my mother used to babysit with his kids. I think he was the director of surgery, or he was one of the high-level doctors. That was back in the mid-40s. Dr. Lefkin lived in the same house that we lived in. Dr. Sullivan also lived in that same house for a while. Dr. Dubile and Tomasulo lived in the, I think it was building 220 and 221. They were just torn down recently to make way for the new resident of the house.
The Fisher House?
Yes. And Dr. Rotsager. But they were all the same breed, I think, that they really cared about the patients, took care of them, would stay at the hospital overnight or even 2 or 3 days if they had some major surgery that they were concerned about. Somewhere along the line, and over, I guess, the last 6 months, and I'm not sure exactly how it came about, but I saw a name on Facebook, Leslie Lefkin, and she made a comment in response to some story that she used to live on campus. So I responded to that comment and said, yes, I lived on campus too, and we lived in the same house. And that shocked her.
I bet it did.
And I invited her to come to this get-together, but she and her brother both are working and couldn't make it. My wife and I did have a meeting with them several months back. And her brother Rick has a whole lot of postcards and pictures and information, I think, that would be of interest and value. So I'm still trying to get them involved in some way that we can sit down with Jake and review some of that stuff.
That would be great. Great. Just as a little background information, it wasn't unusual for the physicians to live here on campus. From the very earliest days, they originally started out being military doctors. And in later years, then we were able to hire more civilian doctors, but it wasn't uncommon for them to live here on campus. In fact, we still have a few residences here that still exist. We have several buildings called Doctors Row that are still here, where the physicians used to live, and also the chaplains, and then we also had a nurses' quarters. So we had a lot of people that worked and lived here, so they had a large investment, in this place. And I was wondering, Charlie, when you were here, do you recall at that time did we have any employees living on campus? What are your memories on that?
Oh yes, Doctors Row was pretty well occupied with doctors when I worked here. Actually, when I became chief in M&R, we had doctors and administrators living on Doctors Row.
Okay.
Building 225 and 226 on the south side of the facility. At one time, I remember Dr. Taguchi and his wife both worked here, and they lived in 226, I believe, there. And I think they were the last physician that lived in that building before we renovated it and made it an administrative building. A footnote, Dr. Long was the chief of the admissions area. I remember just by happenstance his children coming out one Sunday meeting him. His daughter is now my personal physician.
Wow.
How things go. And when I interviewed her, I asked her about her maiden name, and she said my father worked at the VA, and we talked about him. When I started here, it was in the smoke. It wasn't a smoke-free facility, and it was nothing to talk with the doctor, and he's smoking, and you're smoking, and everybody's smoking, talking about health. And one of the transitions that took place during my tenure as chief M&R was the environment of care. The facility in this transitioning phase went from that of old school to more the new school, being health-oriented.
Right.
And speaking about the chapels, for years, the Catholic chapel was the only functioning chapel. The Protestant chapel had fallen in disarray. Asbestos was an issue, as well as other things, and it took quite a bit of time and money and effort to get the chapels back. A lot of the chaplains did their services in the hospital or at patient bedsides until we was able to restore the chapel. And you look at the Protestant chapel, the roof is the original design, I believe, that was done when the chapel was first built. And that was captured, which I think was remarkable, that they would go, and I'm sure that you probably had something to do with that, a picture, something, so you had something to go by. But that was an excellent job on y'all's part to take the time to do that.
Yeah, I know that chapel renovation, it had a couple of renovations phases that it went through, but I know, yeah, there's a great deal of pride taken in how that turned out. And I think that's the Protestant chapel is a real source of pride, I think, to the community too, when they come in and they see it. And to actually sit in a building that Civil War soldiers built themselves, and that it's still serving the same purpose today, because we've restored services in there now. That it did, it's just, it's tying, you know, our long history together. So, Jake, do you have any memories of some of the folks living here?
I'll start with the chapel. We did a lot of work with the chapel, bringing it up from where it was, pretty bad shape. But Chaplain Rome does hold services there every Sunday, and his service is growing. There's more and more people showing up every week.
Great.
And it's from the outside the community, as it was in the beginning, veterans and community. It's a source of pride, it certainly is. But yeah, you remember that, and some of the old buildings that you saw, working inside the buildings and seeing how they're made, they just don't make them like that anymore.
That's right.
You see the craftsmanship and the work, and it's incredible.
Well, from an engineering standpoint, and taking care of all these buildings, you know, what are your memories of, you know, the employees and their dedication to taking care of this place?
I think that was one of the big things when I first hired in, was the dedication of the employee. They really were concerned about doing the right thing for the veteran. And if you kind of sloughed off a little bit, your employees, your fellow employees would let you know. It was a unique experience for me. It certainly was an eye-opener from coming in from the outside.
Sure. Great, thank you.
But to mention, Charlie, we had a Jack Logston, a maintenance foreman, I believe, that lived on the grounds in one of the buildings here.
Okay. Yeah, we don't see that much anymore, but it's good to hear about those days when, I mean, you have more of an investment, I think, when you live here as well as work here.
And in those days also, like I said, we lived here. My dad was the chief machinist, but the chief plumber, chief electrician, and I think all of the chiefs in each one of the maintenance units lived on campus. And like their job was 24/7. Just never knew when they might get a call. So.
Right. So in 2017, the Dayton VA Medical Center celebrated our 150th anniversary. And it was a time of looking back how this campus began back in the 1800s and following through with, our efforts today to preserve our history. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about with you gentlemen what your thoughts are on the preservation efforts of the Dayton VA Medical Center, the things that you've seen happen over the years that maybe we didn't preserve things as well in the past, but now there's a new focus on it. So, Bill, what's your thoughts on the preservation efforts?
Well, I think I'm not sure with what all is happening behind the scenes to preserve what's here, but I know that what was referred to as Doctor's Row is being preserved. The 5 buildings, and I think each was a double that housed 10 doctors in that area. And I think that's really a positive thing. The most recent buildings that have been torn down kind of makes me sad. But they had not been taken care of, and they just more or less rotted away.
Right.
One of the new things that the 4 buildings in the parade ground that are relatively new compared to everything else, they're supposed to be torn down in the 20-year plan. And I'm just thinking sometimes, why aren't those preserved to house some of the homeless veterans? That would be a big plus. And I'm sure if the veterans, sometimes they say, well, we don't want to have a handout. They would appreciate it just like the old timers did. Not look at it as a handout, but as an opportunity to have a safe place. And give them a lawnmower and a hoe and some flowers and let them do what the old guys did 100 years ago.
Well, Charlie, when you got here, I know that you mentioned that you were sad to see the conservatory go, and that was one of the structures you wish that could have been saved. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts about what efforts were made to preserve things when you were here, if there was any, and if there wasn't, have you seen a difference in recent years as far as the focus on preservation?
I think there has been a focus on it's not to salvage, at least to record what was here, more so than was in the past when I first came. You lose opportunities when people go, or people pass on, but I think now progress is the driving force behind all of our changes. Unfortunately for us in the healthcare industry, we are driven by regulations. Many of the old buildings became untenable because they didn't meet changes in codes for patient care. And the upkeep of them, the funding was removed because the building wasn't being used. Speaking from working in engineering service, the Ronald McDonald House was replaced, torn down and replaced with the new facility that they have now, which is a spectacular building.
You're referring to the Fisher House?
The Fisher House.
Okay.
The Ronald McDonald House served its purpose for many years, but it was never quite up to the standards that the medical center wanted for veteran families to come while they was here. The Fisher's House is a great replacement, but the building that was the Ronald McDonald House was a significant part of the growth of the medical center. I would hope that someone has captured that building, pictures of it, as well as 217, the doctor's quarters where they did research, which stood fenced in for years because it had just fallen to disarray. If the history is captured, what you are doing, and then for future generations to see it, because we are 20 or 25 years from having no one alive who remember the old facilities, the old buildings, and all they will know are the new buildings. So if we have that history, at least they'll have something to look back on when they're looking into the archives, and they can learn what was here and what we did while we spent our time on this hill.
Well, recently the Dayton VA campus has been designated to become a National Veterans History Center, and so we're going to be bringing veterans history at a national level here to our campus. We have a couple of buildings designated to become the focus of that history. But we've had a group here on campus for a while that's been their mission. It's the American Veterans Heritage Center. And I'd like to ask Jake maybe to talk a little bit about their mission, how your organization started out and where you see it going, and how they've been instrumental in historic preservation here.
They've been quite instrumental at that. Actually, the preservation organization started out with a group called the Friends of the Soldiers Home.
Okay.
A group of about maybe 6 or 7 people that employees here and other interested people formed, decided to do something about it. Then we morphed into the AVAC, the American Veterans Heritage Center. We got some heavyweights on the board now. So they're doing quite well. They have preserved the chapel, the Protestant chapel.
Mm-hmm.
I think the library building is the next building. 120 is the next building in line to be. Well, I know the old administration building is next, and then the building 120. So up until 1930, the old administration building was the national headquarters for the VA system.
Mm-hmm.
So they've got their priorities in order. It's just frustrating to me. It takes so doggone long. I see some of the outside fancy metal work deteriorating, birds building nests in it, and things. That will add and increase the speed of the deterioration, but it's a process. We have to go through it. What could possibly cost $1 million will cost 10 by the time we get to it, but it's the process. We have to go through it.
Right.
And again, the attitude toward veterans has much changed, as Bill alluded to. I lifted a phrase out of one of our early board of directors from the VA, Louis B. Gunkel, and in his statements, he said, "It is too often the case that when men are in a position to be cared for, they soon lose ambition and become more unwilling to help themselves in the same proportion as they are helped." I really believe that's relevant today also, but it was how the VA was founded, and we've come a long way, but the restoration process is ongoing, and it will continue.
Right.
We're just a few blocks away from the Wright Dunbar district, which I see us hooking into that at some point.
Really feel there's, in the past 10 years or so, a lot more of a community support. I think that I'm feeling it for our history and preserving our history. We're no longer just that VA up on the hill that nobody really knew much about, but we're
I grew up in Dayton, and that was we knew it was here. We had really no idea what was here.
Right.
But,
exactly. Well, I would really like to thank Mr. Bill Arthur, Mr. Charlie Harbour, and Mr. Jake Daly for joining us today and sharing your experiences and your memories of this place. And I'd like to invite anyone who's interested to come out to our campus. You can learn more information about the history of our campus. You could contact the American Veterans Heritage Center. And thank you very much for your time today. Thank you, gentlemen.